Good morning. It is 11 o'clock and I'd like to open this inquiry, which is an appeal into two schemes for up to 250 dwellings off Eldicott Road in Bolton. As a result of the earlier case management conference, the main issue has been identified as the provision and loss of open space. If I could ask, first of all, the appellant to introduce themselves.
Good morning, sir. My name is Constanze Bell of Council. I represent the appellant in this matter, and so I'm calling one witness, a planning witness, Mr. Nigel Cussen.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. And for the local authority.
Good morning, sir. I appear on behalf of the local authority. My name is Jonathan Easton. Easton is spelled E-A-S-T-O-N. I'm a barrister instructed by the Legal Services Department of Bolton Council. Like my learned friend Ms. Bell, I have one witness to call, and that's Mr. Matt Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Easton. We agreed that there would be no examination in chief. Therefore, Mr. Easton, having already introduced your witness, Mr. Jones, if we could move on to cross-examination. Ms. Bell.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Jones. I trust you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Mr. Jones, there's a few propositions you can help me with in the first instance, please. So first of all, let's just start with some standard matters. The inspector is concerned with section 38.6 of the development plan. That's right, isn't it?
It is.
It's the development plan that has statutory force.
Correct.
And we're concerned with whether or not there's compliance with the development plan as a whole, not simply one policy within the development plan.
Yes, I'd agree.
In terms of this particular scheme, we're concerned with private land.
Yes.
We're concerned with unmanaged grassland for the most part.
Yes, unmanaged grassland within the typology green amenity space, that's correct.
It's of no particular landscape value.
That is agreed.
And it's not high quality land in terms of landscape or other features.
Not in terms of landscape features, but as our case puts forward, there is a value to the land in terms of its community use.
We're going to turn to that shortly, Mr. Jones, but perhaps we could start, please, with policy CG1.
Yes.
And I'm just going to pull up policy CG1 for the benefit of the inquiry. And perhaps we could just unpick together policy CG1, Mr. Jones. So firstly, please, policy CG1 is concerned with identifying various typologies of land.
Yes.
And it identifies in the first three categories land types that should be safeguarded and enhanced.
Yes, that's correct.
And if we look particularly at, please, at CG 1.3.
Yes, I have that, thanks.
We're told safeguard and enhance, and then we're given a list of land typologies, including parks, gardens, allotments.
Yes.
And it can be understood, can't it, that in terms of 1.3, there is a mandate to safeguard and enhance the type of land that follows in that list, yes?
That's correct. I suppose there is still the need for some definition around parks and, for example, civic spaces, but also similarly some of the other typologies would come down to the definition of those. But yes, I agree that CG 1.3 is clear in terms of what it seeks to safeguard and enhance.
And we read policy CG1 as a whole.
Yes.
And when we look to CG 1.4,
yes,
we see that it reads allow some development on.
Yes, I see that.
The opening of CG 1.4 is permissive in nature, isn't it?
It's permissive of some development. Therefore, again, there's a question of whether or not some development needs further definition in terms of either the proportion of any particular informal green space that is being developed, i.e. It implies that only some development rather than the development of an informal green space as a whole. And another way of interpreting some would be that there are forms of development that wouldn't be acceptable. That would be a fair interpretation of the word some in that context, in my view.
We know that policy CG1 has been subject to examination in public.
Yes.
And we know we're assisted by the inspector's reasoning on policy CG1, and we're told that the inspector determined that 1.3 provides adequate protection of the most valuable open spaces in the borough. That's right, isn't it?
I accept that the inspector did give a hierarchical differentiation between certain areas of open space as affected by 3 versus 4 as being more general informal green spaces.
So we can deduce, can't we, from reading 3 and 4 together, that the inspector was satisfied that there were some categories that needed to be in the safeguard and enhance category under 1.3, but there was also a need for a permissive approach under 1.4. That would be a fair way of assessing the inspector's reasoning, yes?
I would accept that that's a fair way of summarising the inspector's reasoning. However, the fact that the site was ultimately allocated as a recreation site suggests that in the overall thinking, this was a site that was identified and allocated for recreational purposes, and that would suggest some level of protection, appreciating not to the same level as CG 1.3, which seeks to safeguard and enhance.
We know that there's a commuted sum agreed in the present case that's set out in the Statement of Common Ground.
Yes, and the council's position is that the contribution itself isn't of a sufficient level, but yes, there is a contribution that has been offered and agreed.
And indeed, that sum was the sum suggested by officers, wasn't it?
It was on the basis of the viability evidence that was ultimately agreed to be valid. As we have made in our case, the point being that there is still a question of weight to be applied by the decision maker in terms of whether or not that contribution is sufficient.
Well, Mr. Jones, if we imagine a world in which the scheme comes forward and that commuted sum is therefore available,
yes,
some will be used to improve the existing rounders pitch, won't it?
There are separate contributions. So the protection of the rounders pitch and a contribution of 25,000 to the pavilion has been accepted and agreed. The different contributions between the outline and the full application to off-site open space have been agreed, but in the context of the viability appraisal.
Well, let's just focus, please, on the issue of the pavilion and the agreed position in relation to the pavilion. In a world where the scheme comes forward and the pavilion is provided, the rounders pitch has been improved, hasn't it, by the provision of facilities?
The size will be increased. The overall works proposed by the appellant will ensure that those facilities are improved, including the pavilion. Yes, I agree. So in terms of 1.4, the remaining green space is being improved, isn't it, in a scheme comes forward world? That follows from what you just said. If the wording is to be taken as the remaining green space being land outside of the application site, I would have, in the true spirit of what I think that part of the policy was seeking, was that if development is to be approved on part of areas of informal green spaces, then the remaining areas of informal green space should be improved as a compensatory provision. I think the fact in this case that the whole of the informal green space is being lost to development doesn't leave anything remaining of the informal green space. So I accept that there is provision to improve adjoining open space, more formal open space, but nothing that's remaining of the informal green space.
Well, can we just look, please, at the wording of 1.4? So the very first opening line allows some development on informal green spaces.
Yes, I see that.
If we continue through the logic and the sentence of 1.4,
yes,
we come to improvement. We have improvement of remaining green spaces, don't we?
We do. So
and the word informal is omitted, isn't it?
It is omitted, but similarly,
had the policy draftsman wanted to make clear that remaining green space was limited to remaining informal green space, then they could simply have put informal in between remaining and green spaces, couldn't they?
They could have, and I accept that, as I previously answered, in terms of it could apply to adjoining green spaces, including formal green spaces, but it could also apply to informal green spaces. Unfortunately, in this case, there's no informal green space left as a result of the scale of the development.
Mr. Jones, the plain reading of 1.4 is that you have to improve remaining green space. That's all there is to it. It doesn't matter whether it's formal or informal. The obligation, in the clean terms of the wording of this policy, is to improve remaining green space. That's right, isn't it?
In terms of the plain reading of it, I would argue still, however, that in terms of the spirit of what that part of the policy was seeking to achieve, it was allowing some development on informal green space, but then in the majority of cases, I'd expect on informal green space, allowing for the improvement of any remaining informal green space, appreciating it doesn't say the word informal, but similarly, there is scope to interpret the policy that way, in my view.
Well, Mr. Jones, you're arguing for a much more restrictive wording of 1.4 than that which is actually set out. Let's look, please, at the way the policy opens. Some development on informal green spaces. Now, had the policy draftsman wanted to make clear that some informal green space must remain, i.e. that you couldn't develop all of any particular parcel of informal green space, they could again have altered the wording of 1.4 to reflect that, couldn't they?
They could have. I suppose the way I'd read it is in the context of other policies and strategic objectives within the core strategy, including strategic objective number 1, which relates to a healthy Bolton, which does include access to green infrastructure. So I think what the draftsperson was seeking to achieve with point 4 is that whilst in an ideal situation, particularly in the context of strategic objective 1, Bolton should be able to retain as much green space as possible, notwithstanding the need for housing. There is a compromise that's been required to allow some development on informal green spaces. I don't think it was a carte blanche invitation for all informal green spaces to be developed within the planned period.
We can agree there, Mr. Jones, and in fact we might have to bring this discussion to a close, but can we agree before we do that we have a permissive policy that allows some development on green space and then provides 2 considerations? Firstly, improving remaining green space, and secondly, helping to meet strategic objectives.
I accept that it's permissive of some development, and as I've qualified already, my interpretation of what some development might mean, and I agree that it does then go on to talk around the improvement of remaining green spaces, which we've discussed, and also meeting strategic objectives for housing.
So if you are looking for assistance in terms of what some development might mean in practice, how are you to apply that policy and filter some development from all development? You look, don't you, Mr. Jones, to 1.4 and you realise that provided that you are improving remaining green space and helping to meet the strategic objectives for housing, you fall in category of some development to be allowed?
That would be a fair way of applying that part of the policy, with the caveats that I've sought to place on its interpretation, i.e. how it sits within the wider context of the core strategy, including the strategic objective to protect the health and well-being of residents.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. I'm mindful of the time, sir, and I propose to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bell. Mr. Easton, any questions in re-examination?
Thank you. No, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. No questions from me. Ms. Bell, is that Mr. Easton, is that the council's case?
It is, sir. Yes, thank you very much.
Sir, if I could call Mr. Cussen to give his evidence.
Good morning.
We'll move straight to cross-examination. Examination in chief is already taken as read from the evidence. If I could remind those parties participating, if microphones could be muted when you are not speaking, it should assist us in the steady flow of the cross-examination. And Mr. Easton, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Mr. Cussen.
Good morning.
Now, I'm going to examine with you a number of the points that Ms. Bell examined with Mr. Jones. And to do that, I think we need to go back to policy CG1 of the core strategy. Which hopefully you should see on your screen. Do you see CG, the core strategy on your screen, Mr. Cussens?
Unfortunately not, no. That's it. Yeah, that's come up now.
Got it.
Thank you, Mr. Easton.
Thank you. Can we agree together, please, that policy CG1, and particularly policy CG 1.4, is the most important policy for determining the issue the inspector outlined at the beginning of this inquiry?
Yes, that's the key consideration.
Okay. And if you have on the screen in front of you the heading that says cleaner and greener Bolton starting at paragraph 4.33, do you have that in front of you?
I do, yeah.
On the screen. And then we can scroll down. So this is the explanatory text which precedes policy CG1, and it refers to spatial planning being of fundamental importance in delivering sustainable development at a local level. The Council is committed to improving environmental quality and addressing and minimising the causes of climate change. And we can scroll down and see references to green infrastructure at paragraph 435, climate change in 436, and then we come to policy CG1. Can you agree this, please, Mr. Cussen, that the context for policy CG1 is about protecting and enhancing the environment of Bolton, isn't it?
It is, yes. That's
yeah. And so when you can also accept, can't you, that when one reads policies, one has to read them in their proper context within a development plan document.
Yes, that's correct.
And if we look at policy CG1 and we get to policy CG4, which is the most relevant part, you'd agree, wouldn't you? CG 1.4 is the most relevant aspect of CG1?
In regard to this
in regard to this appeal.
Issues before the appeal, yes.
Yeah. And the inspector needs to be satisfied, doesn't he, that there is no conflict with this particular policy in order to conclude that there is compliance with the development plan taken as a whole.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And I don't think you're suggesting, are you, for one moment, that the reference to allowing some development on informal green space in the urban area means that all informal green spaces in the urban area in Bolton can be built upon, are you?
I think the interpretation of this element of the policy that we've taken is that it allows, as it says, read prima facie, some development on informal space, not all of the informal spaces across Bolton, but also it's got the caveats, providing it allows for improvement and meets the strategic objectives for housing, and that's those tests are applied in this case, and in defining the policy, it was clear if you look at policy paragraph 435 above, that in the policy has taken into regard the overall open space assessment undertaken by the council. So yes, it's not all space, but certainly there are spaces that can be developed.
Okay, so it follows from what you've just said then that the answer to my question, does this policy allow the development of all informal green spaces in the urban area and its replacement with built development? The answer to that question is no, it doesn't, isn't it?
Yes, it's not all space.
Right. And so a number of things need to be understood before one reaches a conclusion about compliance or not with policy CG 1.4. One is whether or not the proposal would allow for the improvement of remaining green spaces.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yes.
And two, whether or not the proposal in question helps to meet the strategic objectives for housing.
Yes.
Yeah. And that judgment, those judgments have to be reached in the context of your acceptance that not all informal green space within the urban area can be built on in compliance with this policy.
There isn't an upper limit provided by this policy there in terms of the amount of space that can be developed upon.
Okay. Notwithstanding the way in which my then friend Ms. Bell put it, allowing some development as being somehow a permissive policy, it doesn't mean, does it, that informal green spaces are devoid of any protection?
They're available for development under the criteria stated within the policy, and yes, within an assessment of all of the material considerations.
Okay, but let's just go back to the question. The allowing some development, which on one interpretation might be seen as being a permissive wording, doesn't mean, does it, that informal green spaces are devoid of any protection in the core strategy, does it?
They're not devoid of any protection. They're protected by the policy, inherent in the policy. There are criteria in there allowing for improvement of other spaces and meeting the objectives for housing. I think there is a judgment for the decision maker to take, yes.
Okay, right. So in terms of allowing for the improvement of remaining green spaces, let's just focus on that for one moment, please. So the balance that one needs to carry out under policy CG 1.4 is the balance between allowing some informal green spaces to be lost to development, and that balance has to be put against two things: improvement of remaining green spaces and the satisfaction of strategic objectives for housing. So can we agree this, please, that when one is looking at the extent to which there's going to be an improvement of remaining green spaces, one is looking in particular at the extent to which the loss of the existing green space can be offset by improvements of other green spaces?
Yes, that's part of the consideration.
Right. And so in that scenario, the green space that is being lost is informal green space, about which this policy is speaking, isn't it?
Yes.
And so when you're looking at the improvement of remaining green spaces, because that is the offsetting job you are trying to undertake, it must be a reference, mustn't it, remaining green spaces to informal green spaces?
No, I think the balance that's being considered is to what degree the loss of the informal space is being offset by an improvement to remaining space. It doesn't, as we've heard from the council, it doesn't include just informal green space. It's remaining spaces. In the case of this site, there is the adjacent land that's being improved. There's also the contributions being made for off-site improvements to other green spaces. So no, I don't agree that it is primarily you have to improve other informal green spaces.
Mr. Easton, I'm sorry if I could interrupt. Mr. Cussen, we can spend hours talking about the definitions of informal green spaces, the remaining green spaces, and precisely what it includes. But along the lines of Mr. Easton's question, informal green spaces serve a specific purpose, don't they? And therefore, if we are losing something that serves a specific purpose, surely we should be making sure that we compensate for it with something that will also deal with that specific purpose, rather than something which deals with open spaces generally.
I think reading the policy needs to be read on its face, and the fact is the council haven't included informal green spaces within that criteria as being the area that needs to be improved, and the compensatory measure can be made in other green spaces of various definitions. The adjacent space that's been improved there's largely formal playing fields in it, but there's no reason why some of the informal use of the existing space couldn't be undertaken on those other spaces. You know, we've seen that dog walking and the like can be undertaken on our space, on the space being considered by the application. That can be undertaken elsewhere as well, on formal and informal space.
Thank you, Mr. Easton.
Do we see anywhere in this policy, or indeed elsewhere in the core strategy, a definition of the term green space?
I don't have one to hand.
No, because if we look in CG 1.3, that references parks, gardens, allotments, civic spaces and playing fields. And there's a reference to quality and multifunctional benefits of these assets. So they are given individual labels, those different typologies of open space, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
Yeah. And so, and there's nothing else that I can see within policy CG1 or indeed the explanatory text that suggests that green spaces is an all-encompassing term which includes those individual typologies in CG 1.3. Can you say anything?
No.
No. So picking up the point the inspector made just a few moments ago, that the purpose of CG 1.4, the compensatory element, which is the improvement of remaining green spaces, is meant to compensate or offset the loss of a particular typology given a name, informal green space. So read sensibly, Mr. Cussen, it must be a reference to informal green space that we're talking about when it comes to improvement, mustn't it? Read sensibly.
No, I don't think it does. I think it's an open, you know, it's a more open definition than the informal spaces. It needs to include other more formal spaces, and there's no reason why it can't be, and it should be more. If it had been intended to be read more specifically, it would have been written in that way.
Okay, I have just one short topic to finish off with, and this requires us to go to the National Planning Policy Framework. Do you have that on your screen in front of you?
Yes.
I've got the definition section. And there's a reference there to open space, and we can read for ourselves what the definition of an open space is: of public value, including not just land, all areas of water, which offer important the opportunities for sport and recreation can act as a visual amenity. The part of the appeal site which is going to have houses built upon it falls currently, doesn't it, within the definition of open space?
Yes.
Yeah. And can we agree this as a general proposition, please, that when you're considering policies in a development plan, particularly development plans which predate the most recent expression of national policy, one should do one's best to read those policies in a way that's consistent with up-to-date national policy. Do you agree?
Yes, I do.
Right. So in that context, we've got open space. Can we go to paragraph 96 of the National Planning Policy Framework, which should be on the screen in front of you? Yeah. Is it?
It is, yes.
Good. And we can have a look at paragraph 97. Paragraph 97, existing open space, sports and recreation buildings and lands, including playing fields, should not be built upon unless, and there's a series of three criteria which are to be read disjunctively. Do you see that?
Yes.
Yeah. So in order to comply with national policy, your client would need to bring their scheme within one or more of those exceptions, wouldn't they?
Yes.
Yeah. And so can we just look at these for a moment, please? So existing open space should not be built upon. The reason I extracted sports and recreational buildings and land, etc., is because the part of the land on which houses are going to be built, it falls within the broader open space definition, doesn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Unless A, an assessment has been undertaken which has clearly shown the open space buildings or land to be surplus to requirements.
Yeah.
Or the loss resulting from the proposed development would be replaced by an equivalent or better provision in terms of quantity and quality in a suitable location. Pause there for a moment. You don't rely upon that exception, do you, in this case?
Not exception B, no.
No. And then C, the development of an alternative sports and recreational provision, benefits of which clearly outweigh the loss of the current or former use. Again, you don't rely upon that, do you?
No.
So the question of whether or not there is compliance with national policy revolves around, doesn't it, whether or not an assessment has been undertaken which clearly shows the open space to be surplus to requirements. That's the focus of the next session of cross-examination.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, I think we've been going on for quite some time now, Mr. Cussens, and I will perhaps pick this up after we have a short break. Would that be convenient, sir?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Easton. Ms. Bell, were there any questions you'd like to ask in re-examination?
No, thank you, sir.
In that case, may I just thank all of the parties and draw this inquiry to a close. Many thanks.